Today we're going to talk about debt. Why is debt important? Because developing countries borrow a tremendous amount of money, and how they borrow that money and how they're able to pay back that money is critical for their long-term sustainability and growth. The IMF is predicting, as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, that the world is going to face the greatest depression since the 1930s. And along with that comes a significant recession in low-income countries. The result of these economic challenges and pressures is an increase in debt vulnerability. African ministers recently said that they have about $44 billion in debt service obligations through the end of this year, and called on the international community to help them cover those payments so that they're able to respond both to the health and the economic challenges that their countries face. So this gets to the question of, why is debt important? Why does it matter? What's its impact on the world's lowest income countries? Well, here's what happens. As countries take on greater and greater levels of debt, more and more of their government spending has to go to service that debt, to pay back that debt. And sometimes they're faced with trade-offs, where countries are spending more money on paying back the debt that they've borrowed than they are on healthcare or education. And if countries default on that debt, if they're unable to pay it back, it can have really serious economic ramifications and impact their ability to borrow. And the challenge is that in the world's lowest income countries, they don't have the same sort of fiscal or monetary capabilities as the world's richest countries. So they're dependent on a global response. They're dependent on global support to help them find capital to address the immediate crisis, but also to address the longer-term economic impacts. So what can be done about it? The IMF has announced that it's providing debt relief through its Catastrophe Containment and Relief Trust for 25 of its poorest borrowing countries. But there are advocates in the development community who are calling on the IMF to go farther, not just to rely on donor capital, but to rely on their own reserves to provide some of this debt forgiveness. The G20 also agreed to what is essentially a debt freeze through the end of the year for the world's poorest countries. While those countries will later have to pay off that debt, it will immediately free up some funds so that they can respond to the immediate healthcare and economic crisis. But again, development advocates have said that it's essentially just kicking the can down the road on important issues of debt sustainability, that it has to essentially be a stepping stone on the path to a more robust conversation about debt relief and debt sustainability, and that the systems in place today to address these issues are insufficient. Traditionally, debt forgiveness decisions has been made by the Paris Club, an informal group of 22 creditors who get together to discuss debt forgiveness or debt restructuring programs. The challenge is that a growing amount of lending comes from countries that aren't part of that Paris Club. China, for example, is not part of the Paris Club, and this presents a growing challenge because 20 to 25% of debt in sub-Saharan Africa is owned by China. And one critical thing to know about debt is that if one creditor or one group of creditors provides debt relief, but not everyone participates, you end up with a situation where the debt relief from one creditor may in fact just go to pay off the debt obligations to another. So having a coordinated system of debt relief and forgiveness and discussion and decision-making is critical. So development advocates have long called for reforms in the process of how debt decisions get made, for inclusion of new creditors, and that includes also private creditors. Low-income countries often take on significant private debt in addition to public debt or borrowing that they're doing from multilateral development banks. And it's important that each of those components is considered as debt relief moves forward. When the G20 released their communique announcing their debt freeze, they left an opening for continued discussions around the issue. And we certainly expect this to be a part of the conversation in response to the current crisis and in general to having more sustainable development finance in the year and years ahead. So for all that coverage, stay tuned to Devex.